My name's Rob Hopkins from Transition Network and TransitionTown.net, which is the first transition initiative in the UK. My background has been in practical sustainability, so teaching people how to garden, how to build using natural materials, energy efficiency, that kind of stuff. Very practical, hands-on, sort of outside planting and building things kind of background. So transition for me is something that's almost sort of happened by accident, really. I was teaching at a college and we found out about peak oil and climate change and did a project looking at the practicalities of what the move away from oil dependency might actually look like in practice. And it's just sort of gained and gained and gained momentum, really. And I myself have very much been on a crash course. You know, in 2004, I hadn't even heard the term peak oil. I knew a little bit about climate change. I thought we were talking about something that was like 100 years away. I'd never really thought about the idea that oil, I mean, I knew oil was a finite resource, but I'd never really given it much thought. And I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Colin Campbell, who's one of the world authorities on peak oil, and he kind of gave me a crash course in it, and then I've been sort of finding out more and more about it ever since, really. But I think transition is really something that is a synthesis from lots of different places. You know, it draws from insights from the environmental movement, from the practical change movements, from psychology, from a whole range of different things, and what we call transition now is very much a result of that synthesis.
Why are we not able to give a more definitive timeline as to when we absolutely have to transition off of the depletion of fossil fuels? You know, what they're saying is, yeah, but you know, we're using fracking techniques now, and we've still got a huge supply of coal, and there is some energy out there that we are going to be able to use. And I believe that many people are confused because we're not, and maybe we can't, we are not coming up with, by next year at this time, we won't have the use of oil. And so consequently, you need to make the transition this year. That's not happening. And so people are saying, it's in the future, it's in the future, it's in the future. How do we address that?
There's a distinction between running out of oil and peak oil. Peak oil doesn't mean we're about to run out, that tomorrow you're going to go to the pump and they'll say, sorry, that's it, all gone, world reserves completely dried up. You know, actually peak oil is the moment you go from having an expectation of more and more every year to the beginning of an expectation of less and less every year. It's not like falling off the edge of a cliff. It's a change in direction. But because we've always built our economy around the idea that we're going to have more of it every year, and that's our expectation, it will be a big shift. The reason why it's not possible to put an exact date as to when it's going to happen is because because the information you need to be able to make that assessment isn't all in the public arena. You know, if I want to know how many chocolate biscuits I've got left in my biscuit tin, I can go and look in the biscuit tin and count them up and see how many there are and work out how long I'm going to be able to eat chocolate biscuits for. But actually, now about 80% of oil that's produced in the world isn't produced by Shell, BP, Exxon, those companies. It's produced by state oil companies like in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. And they're very, very secretive and very, very protective of the data that they have. And there was one of the WikiLeaks documents that came out recently said that that Saudi Arabia has been overinflating its reserves by about 40%. So the data isn't really clear. But I think, firstly, it doesn't really matter when the peak is in some ways, because actually we certainly seem to be close to it or in the foothills of it. And the International Energy Agency report that came out last year said, just in one little sentence after they'd rubbished the idea of peak oil for the last 20 years, little paragraph that said that talked about the peak of conventional oil production, which happened in 2006. So what we're relying on more and more is these unconventional oils, the tar sands and so on. And what's clear is that actually when you get into the downward half of that peak oil graph, you still have oil. You still have fossil fuels, but they're very, very different to the ones you had on the other half of it, on the upside. There you had easy oil, you had cheap oil. In Saudi Arabia, you stick a hole in the ground, out it comes under pressure. You don't have to do a great deal. The oil we're talking about now, as we start moving down, is much, much more labor intensive, more energy intensive to extract. It's in much more remote and sort of pristine and quite dangerous places to extract from. You have to put a lot more energy in to get it out. So oil produced in the 1930s, you put 1 unit of energy in, you got about 100 units of energy back. Now, on the downward side, we're looking at the oil sources we get excited about, things like the tar sands, which are 2 or 3 to 1, gas fracking, which is kind of something similar. There's not... it's very, very, very different. There's still oil, but it's going to be more expensive, much, much harder to get.
When you say 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, Richard Heinberg, who talks a lot about this, puts it really nicely. He says, if you're a fox and you need to eat rabbits and you spend all day running around after rabbits and you never catch any, you're not going to be a fox very long. If you put all your energy into catching food and you never do, then you're a bit stuffed. So the idea of energy return on investment is getting energy out of anything requires some kind of energy. You have to put something in to get it back out again. So drilling through very shallow into the ground in a desert, don't need much infrastructure, very, very, very straightforward to do. Now, drilling in the middle of the Gulf, it requires a massive amount of infrastructure, huge amounts of investment. So the amount of energy you get back for the amount you put in falls. And there's lots of debates within the kind of literature about this, about at what point, below what point does a society become unsustainable? If all your energy sources, you have to put as much energy in to get energy back out again, then it's game over, really. So it's one of the things that's rarely talked about. When we talk about gas fracking and oil shale and tar sands, and people get hugely excited. Well, there's hundreds of years of shale out there. Yeah, but actually the energy return from it is fairly woeful, really.
What is this new life going to look like if we can't go on with business as usual?
I think one of the things that's really important in transition is if you say to people, we can't go on with business as usual, and then just leave people with that thought, it's really irresponsible. It's like you kind of blow somebody's worldview to pieces and then just sort of leave them sat there in the splinters and the smoke, And so transition is really about trying to articulate what the alternative is. And I think any alternative that we come up with to business as usual needs to be one which is designed from the outset around the demands that our situation makes of us. So we need to move forward in such a way that acknowledges that we live on a finite planet, that there are limits to growth, there are material and ecological limits to the amount that we can do. It needs to be something that can thrive and reproduce itself and create economic activity without a dependency on cheap fossil fuels to enable that. It needs to be something which sits within the reductions in carbon emissions, which scientists are arguing that we need. To by 2050 to cut our emissions by about 90%. Which actually it's an enormous, historically unprecedented challenge. For the UK, that means that by 2050, the amount of carbon we produce per capita needs to be currently what Mozambique produce in terms of carbon emissions. And I don't see any way around that without arguing that the future is going to be much, much more local than it is today. At the moment, the UK exports 1.5 million kilos of potatoes to Germany and imports the same amount. We send the same amount of milk and butter to Holland as we import from there. We send Canada 39,000 scarves. We import 49,000 scarves. As Herman Daly says, we could just email each other the recipes and actually have a much more sensible way of doing things. So transition's approach is that we're looking at a future which is more local, which is about shortening the distance between producer and consumer, which is about people being much more skilled, about our urban fabric being much more productive. So we live in a kind of hanging gardens of Babylon of kind of fruit and vegetables, and that's part of our everyday life. Towns and cities are much more closely and intimately linked to the farms around them. We've redesigned things so that we aren't dependent on cars. We work much closer to home. We maybe don't have one kind of career in the way that we do now, but maybe we have a number of different things that we do. Our houses are highly, highly insulated. Any new buildings are built using drawing from a kind of a local industry of building materials. So we sit within an economy. It's not to say that we've become completely sort of myopic and hunkered down and shut off from the world. I think transition is a very interesting example of a globalized movement of communities looking at localization and sharing their experiences with each other globally. But if we're going to make our communities more resilient to these challenges, I think inevitably they're going to be much, much more localized.
If we don't start educating our populations globally from elementary on up, the primary education, then we're going to be lost anyway, because we can't just educate the people, the older people who are now facing the crisis. We have to educate the younger people who are going to be living in a world that is vastly different than the one that they were born into.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need our schooling system to be producing young people who are fit, who are problem solvers, and actually I think the obsession with qualifications and grades and exams has been hugely detrimental, and I think it's that we need to be producing young people who are fit, who are motivated, who are problem solvers, who have a toolbox of skills that are more appropriate to this time. They know how to grow food, they know how to repair things, but that is presented to them as these are the skills you really need. And also they need to be entrepreneurial. They need to be able to know, because they need to be able to know they can make an imaginative livelihood out of this, because at the moment we are raising children with an expectation that they are going to be living and going out to work in a world which isn't going to be there. And it's already the case, we're still, like here in the UK, we have young people leaving school. There's not really very many jobs around. Then they're supposed to go to university and leave university owing £40,000 worth of debt before they even then get into the workplace. And this is a time when actually we need, we need hundreds of thousands, millions of young people out there actively being part of the solution to this. So for me, I think that education starts, I mean, certainly here, with a lot of the stuff that happens in the schools now around green schools and eco schools, a lot of the time kids at primary school know far more about this stuff than their parents do. And they know far more about climate change and what to do and what to turn off and how to compost and how to recycle than their parents do. But then something happens when they get into the next level, when they're 12 or 13, that stuff just sort of rather falls away. And actually I always think, like Ivan Illich and people like that who argued that schools should be like workshops, and schools should be a place where you walk into the school through a market garden, and the food that you eat comes from that garden, and the landscaping of the school is done in that way, and it's just woven into the fabric of everyday life. It's not even something you even notice necessarily. It's just part of everyday life.
Just an observation. One of the things that you said was that young people and certainly older people too are going to need to be fit for this new world. And of course, that's absolutely true. And I think if people start thinking along those lines, let's see, why would I need to be fit? Well, you're going to need to be fit because you're going to be out there helping produce what you need to eat and how you live and how you stay warm. I still think, Robin, you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. I still think that people are finding that very hard to grasp, that it isn't not going to be a choice. I still think that people think that they can choose an alternative. Right? It's not a choice anymore. This, whether people like it or not, this is a transition that we are in probably the later stages of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I often think back, I mean, I was only 10 or something at the time, but that period at the end of the 1970s, at the end of the oil crisis was a really historic fork in the road, I think. You know, we had the opportunity then. If you read back, there was an exhibition in Canada a while ago that was called Out of Gas, that was all about the 1970s oil shocks, but particularly looked at the kind of flowering of creative responses that happened during that time, and the amount of money that went into researching renewables and things like permaculture, bio-intensive farming, urban agriculture, all the different renewables technologies, underground buildings, earthships, all that stuff that is now the kind of cornerstone of green building and sustainable agriculture flowered in that period of about 6 years when everyone thought, shit, and just all kind of geared up and responded with incredible creativity. When we got to 1979, we had everything we needed in place. If we'd have decided, actually, do you know what? You can keep the oil. We're just going to go for it, and we're going to make sure we never get into this situation ever again. We wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing now in terms of climate to anywhere near that degree. We'd be seeing a completely different kind of industrial sector in the countries. We'd be our farming policies would be completely different. That was such a window of opportunity, and I think really now we've left it to a point, as you say, where it's not a question of whether we have to do it. It's a question of whether we can do it in time. Because, you know, there was a study that was done in 2005 in the US called the Hirsch Report, and they were asked to look at how far ahead of the peak in world oil production you needed to start preparing in order to be able to have something resembling a smooth transition. They said ideally 20 years, 10 years at a push if you have a kind of wartime mobilization kind of scale of response. We may already have passed it, or we're certainly, I would think, within 5 years of that. So we don't have the luxury of wondering whether it's going to be the case or not.
Here in the U.S., our elected officials are certainly letting us down. I understand, you know, that there is no need to create panic, though maybe a little panic wouldn't be such a bad thing. You know, to make certain that people understand that the time to prepare really we should have, as you just suggested with the Hirsch report, we should have been preparing a long time before now. Maybe a little bit of panic is not such a bad thing. You know, look what happened in China with the earthquake, or in Japan with the earthquake. You know, it wakes people up. It's like, okay, we aren't as well prepared as we thought we were for a new future. But at least over here, our elected officials refuse to touch this issue, other than to say, now they all agree that it looks like oil supplies are diminishing, but they love to confuse people with the difference between resources and reserves. I mean, there's just so, you know, the jargon that they can use to make people think, you know what, I don't understand it, so I guess I'll let it go for now. And we've been doing that for the last 10 years. I don't know if your experience with politicians has been any different than what we're experiencing over here.
I think that I think politics is an incredibly difficult world in which to be visionary, and you know, we have some dealings with politics here. But I'm also, I mean, the first part of your question about panic, you know, is it better if people panic? I'm not so sure that that's the most skillful way to do it, actually. I think some people respond well to being panicked. Some people respond well to a big kick out the backside and you know, and something that makes them go, oh, really, God. But a lot of people, that's not what drives people. You know, people are, you know, we shouldn't forget that the vast majority of people are about 2 weeks' paychecks away from being kicked out of the where they live. It's worse where you are because, you know, there's much less in terms of social safety nets to catch people if they start to fall, and so in that kind of context, for a lot of people to say, but don't you realize it's all going to come to an end tomorrow, and is actually really counterproductive, because people are like, well, what else? What do you want me to do? You know, what else can I do? And so for me, part of what's really valuable about transition as we've developed it is that it says it's not okay just to give people loads of really depressing information and expect them to do something. You need to also design into it some kind of a supportive framework, some kind of a supportive initiative or space where people can digest that and what it actually means to them with other people who they trust and who they're around, who are wondering about the same thing. Because actually, you know, for every one person who goes, really, oh my God, that's really serious, I'll tell you what, I'll insulate the house and I'll grow some carrots. There's about 9 people who just go, don't want to know. But actually, if actually in their daily life they see things around them changing, they see people who they know and respect who are starting to do those things, that kind of peer pull is actually much more powerful and much more useful. So that's very much where we come at it in transition. You know, that there are those kind of early adopters who go, really, oh my God, and who get started like that. But actually, we need to, in terms of engaging everybody else, we need to be much more skillful about it.
As gas rises, it makes people tune in more to what am I going to do when I can't afford gasoline? Just talk a little bit about gasoline.
Yeah, well, one liter of gasoline or petrol, as we would call it here, has energy in it equivalent to about 35 days hard human manual labor. You know, so if you could pay somebody whatever it is, $1.50 or something, to come round and work for you for a month for that much, that's not bad, you know. If your car ever runs out of petrol and you have to just push it into the lay-by, you know, actually that's a lot of effort. But a litre of petrol will push that car 30 miles. So, you know, I think we've really lost a sense of what an absolutely extraordinary thing it is. What a historically unprecedented, remarkable energy punch we're able to carry that would have just been unimaginable to 2 or 3, 4 generations ago. So here at the moment it costs now £1.36 a litre for diesel. It cost about £1.10 only about 3 months ago. It's risen very sharply. I think it's more expensive here because we have more taxes on it. But it's interesting here. There's a obviously, you know, people are really starting to feel it. Hauliers are starting to feel it. People who live in more remote rural areas or travel a lot for work are starting to feel it. And there's lots of kind of you know, organisations like the AA and organisations that are set up to sort of argue for the rights of motorists, as saying this is mad and the government needs to help. And I think we've got the government are doing a budget here today, and all the talk is that they're going to bring in some way of reducing the tax to try and help people out. And I got asked onto the local radio here the other day to talk about this, because I think I was the only person they could find in the whole country who, or certainly that they knew of, who would come on and argue that actually it was a really good idea to keep the tax on. Because this is only going in one direction. And if we're talking about the kind of situation we were just talking about in terms of the Hirsch report and the need to prepare, you know, if you've got a relative who's an alcoholic and you really care about them facing up to that and being mature about it and trying to respond to it in a way which is healthy, the last thing you want to do is to give them vouchers off, like discount vouchers for the local liquor store, and I think it is really the main thing that will focus our minds. Is actually, you know, we've had 10 years of campaigns about drive slower, use less, conserve energy. I think we've kind of pushed that one about as far as we can, and it hasn't got us anywhere near far enough. And so, you know, actually. Because also the other thing is that actually when the oil price rises, the economics start to change. So when oil cost $147 a barrel in July 2008, that was the first time there was a window there for the first time in about 20 years when it became cheaper for the US to make its own steel again than it was to import it from China. And so the current economic model goes, oh my God, if oil's too expensive, everything will fall to bits and we won't be able to carry everything around. So that keeps kind of tried to be pushed away and pushed away. But there's a barrier there that once we get through it to the other side, there's actually a whole load of new economics that start to come into play, which favor the local, which favor the community scale. All those things we've bulldozed for the last 40, 50 years. And we should remember as well, of course, that the shift we've seen in our towns and our cities and our high streets over the last 50 years of devaluing local farmers, devaluing local food, seasonal food, devaluing small shops, that sort of dismantling of that whole infrastructure that is now kind of just put down to, well, that was progress. That was just the inevitable rolling of progress. It wasn't inevitable rolling of progress. It was a very intentional, driven process that was driven by things like the GATT treaty, the kind of international treaties about protectionism and prizing open the markets of countries and flooding them with subsidized produce. You know, it's not something that's happened by accident. It was an economic push. And what will happen when we can break through, and we acknowledge that we're in a world of high energy, is that globalization goes into reverse. And actually, that will be an enormous shock to people. But then so was the process we've seen over the last 50 years. You know, it drove farmers to suicide. It bankrupted lots of people. It drove many millions of people off the land. But we're supposed to just go, well, that was just inevitable, you know. But actually, the changing now as we go back the other way is going to be a process that's going to throw open many opportunities for people who are entrepreneurial and imaginative and creative. And of course, there'll be a fading away of some of the things that at the moment we think are completely irreplaceable. But like I say, it's inevitable, and we can either choose to try and wish it away and stick our head in the sand, or we can be realistic and embrace this with creativity.
Will climate change be favorably affected by the transition once the transition is done, and we certainly can't use these depleted fossil fuels any longer? Will we see our climate improve?
It depends on the nature of the transition we have. Because if we just don't do anything now, then we see what's happening already. You know, we see tar sands, which were always considered unconventional oil, being seen as conventional oil. We'll see things like fracking become a mainstream way of producing natural gas, with all the hideous environmental and climate change implications of that. I think, you know, certainly what the scientists say about climate change is that, you know, we've already gone up 0.8 degrees on pre-industrial levels. Even if we stopped burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, we've still got another 0.6 kind of lag in the system, which has yet to impact. And I think it's almost inevitable that we're going to go above 2 degrees, even in the kind of very well managed descent kind of scenarios. But then, you know, if we can, so I think then definitely that, you know, this has to be accompanied by some very meaningful legislation, and we need to stop our governments pouring the billions of dollars and pounds of subsidies they do into the fossil fuel industry, as compared to the tiny amount that they put into the renewable sector. You know, this is, I always say to people, you know, this is a transition which, if we pull it off, will be completely historically unprecedented. You know, this will be something that, if we manage to do it, is something that people in 20 years' time from now will tell stories about and sing songs about. It'll be remarkable. The agricultural revolution took place over thousands of years. The industrial revolution took place over, you know, tens, hundreds of years. This needs to happen incredibly quickly, and so it will need international stuff, national government, local government, and communities, which is where the transition side of it comes in. But it needs to be based on asking the right questions, and it needs to be realistic. And one of those things is going to be to say we need to keep the best place for the fossil fuels we have left is to just leave them where they are, and we'll need some of them in order to power and make to produce the renewable energy infrastructure. But we also need to, it was interesting here, Mervyn King, who's the governor of the Bank of England, who advises the government, he said, this is not the kind of recession like previous ones that is all right again after 2 years. And it almost certainly is a kind of recession that we never get better from. And what we're seeing is the is the permanent reduction of living standards in this country. Well, we can either look at that as a cataclysmically dreadful thing, or we can say, hey, do you know what? Actually, what are the things that I really value, and what do I value my sense of well-being and happiness on? Is it actually on GDP and the amount of money coming through, or is it community, relationships, skills, the things I've made? You know, there's different ways of looking at this, and I think what transition tries to do is to say, yeah, this could be ghastly, but you know, the surest way to guarantee it's going to be ghastly is to carry on doing what we're doing now. You know, Albert Einstein said something like, his definition of madness was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think we can do a lot better. And I think the way we're going to get there isn't by telling everybody how ghastly it's going to be. It's by telling everybody how fantastic it's going to be when we get there.
Rob, I don't have any other questions. If there was anything that you needed to impart to people that are going to be watching this through the nation, please feel free to do it now. Otherwise, you know, it was a great interview.
Well, I suppose I would just say that in the US now there are 80 transition projects, but there are a lot more than 80 places in the US. And transitionus.org have a lot of resources there. You can find out what the local transition groups are. And transition is really about looking at this as an opportunity, and this being a process which is creative and fun and playful, but is really about getting on with making a change in this community. It's not something which is just about people who are kind of alternative people, or people from the left or the right or whatever. Transition is something which is about everybody getting involved, playing to their strengths, and actually in the current economic situation, I don't see, in the place where I live, for example, I don't see the economic a revival in this town's fortunes coming from hoping that Apple are going to come in and open a factory, or that some hedge fund managers are going to come and open a business here. You know, actually where the revival of a place like this is going to come from is by starting to rebuild a local economy here. So the food that we eat coming more locally, we have a stronger local farming community. If we build new houses using materials that come from locally, we stimulate all kinds of other industries. And I think we need to get away from the idea that localization is something which just sort of inhabits the pinboards of whole food shops. And we need to start seeing this as a key strand of economic development. You know, we're not in this like as some woolly kind of oppositional thing. This is something which is really about this is where the economy of the future is going to come from, and I think more and more people are starting to see that. But you know, there's many people out there in the world pushing for this, but there need to be many more. So my closing thing would be kind of an invitation, really, to get involved and bring whatever it is you're passionate about. You know, if you're passionate about food, you're passionate about energy, you're passionate about economics, you're passionate about educating young people, you're passionate about whatever, feed it into the transition process, get involved and push. Whether you call it transition or not, nobody really cares. You know, it's what matters is that this is, as I said before, this is a historic time to do historic work, and it needs everybody on board.
Please come back and watch complete interviews with each of the experts. And you can join me, Thom Hartmann, anytime on the web at thomhartmann.com.